I've wanted to read Silent Night by Stanley Weintraub since last May. Yes, May. While everyone else was mowing grass and planning beach trips, I was over here counting down the days until I could curl up with this World War I book. I know that sounds dramatic, but when you're a history-loving librarian who lives for a good Christmas story, waiting 7 whole months feels like an eternity. So, this December, I finally curled up by the tree, opened those pages, and let myself slip into one of the most extraordinary moments in human history. There's something special about reading A Christmas Story by Treelight. The room is dim, the world feels softer, and for a moment, it's almost as if past and present overlap. Like you're sitting at the edge of a story too beautiful and too heartbreaking to rush. I knew The Christmas Truce was remarkable. I didn't realize how human, how tender, how utterly upside down it truly was. The Christmas Truce of 1914 isn't just history. It's a glimpse of what happens when the peace of Christ breaks into the darkest corners of the world. Christmas is, after all, the story of light stepping into darkness. And that year, astonishingly, light reached the western front of World War I. The world they faced. Tension in Europe had been simmering for years. Small conflicts, rivalries, and alliances had created a powder keg. And then came the spark, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie in June 1914. Now, here's where it gets messy. Many military leaders blamed Serbia for the assassination, but in reality, it wasn't that simple. Even the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, yes, he was called the Emperor, knew the evidence was shaky at best. Still, his military advisors pushed him to use the attack as a pretext for war. The emperor didn't want to fight, but pressures mounted, orders were given, and soon shots were fired. What started as a regional squabble between two small nations quickly spiraled out of control. Alliances pulled larger powers in, and before anyone could fully grasp it, Europe was plunged into one of the deadliest conflicts it had ever seen. Propaganda fueled the fire. Posters, speeches, and newspapers painted the enemy as cruel, evil, almost inhuman. Young men of all nationalities, barely out of their teens, enlisted or were drafted, believing they were defending their homelands from monsters. In truth, these monsters were ordinary people just like them. They were pawns in a much larger game, lied to and manipulated by leaders whose priorities weren't peace, but power and prestige. Before we get to the truce itself, it's important to understand just how miserable life in the trenches had become. Everyone thought the war would be over quickly, within weeks, maybe a few months, but the months dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Rain and an unusually warm fall had turned the mud-filled ditches into a constant, miserable slog. Soldiers' feet rotted from trench foot, lice crawled through their clothes and hair, rats became their constant companions, and disease claimed nearly half of all lost lives. Homesickness weighed on them like a second uniform. Christmas, which should have been a time of warmth and light, promised only another cold, grim day far from home. But on Christmas Eve, something changed. Temperatures dropped, and a thin veil of snow began to settle over the trenches. It softened the mud and muted the destruction, wrapping the battlefield in a quiet, gentle hush, as if the world itself had offered a small gift of mercy. For a brief moment, the endless despair lifted. And then, a song. From the German trenches, soft voices began to rise, singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. Across the mud and barbed wire, the British soldiers froze, unsure whether to answer or remain silent. Bruce Bairnsfather of the 1st Royal Warwickshire Regiment later recalled, "I listened. Away across the field, I could hear the murmur of voices. After months of shelling, cold, and snipers, who could trust anything coming from the other side? But slowly, almost shyly, British soldiers joined in. The carol drifted over the shattered landscape, carrying something no rifle or shell could smother. A flicker of hope. A moment of recognition. The quiet realization that the men on the other side were just as human, just as homesick, just as weary as they were. Music in Scripture often announces God's presence. On that battlefield, the trenches became a kind of congregation. The line, "Son of God loves pure light," took on a new meaning under the glow of flares instead of candles. For that brief, breathtaking moment, Christmas, the light and peace of God, had reached one of the darkest places imaginable. Even before the hymn, soldiers had sometimes shouted across the lines, mostly jokes and benign insults, but nothing worse than two London cabbies after a minor collision. The singing, however, changed everything. It was a bridge, fragile, yet undeniable. Cigarettes, chocolate, and little tokens were tossed across no man's land to the other trench. Laughter came in waves and punctured the air. For a few breathtaking hours, the endless cold, mud, and fear seemed to pause. Christmas Eve brought a fragile, fleeting peace. When Christmas came to the trenches. The next morning, Christmas Day, 1914, dawned crisp and cold. In many sectors, even before sunrise, soldiers noticed that the shelling had stopped. Then, from the German lines, a sign appeared in broken English. "You no shoot, we no shoot." A few men held up makeshift white flags, handkerchiefs, towels, even socks tied to the tips of their bayonets, and raised them cautiously above the trench, testing whether gunfire would follow. None came. Across the line, British soldiers watched, uncertain. After seemingly endless attacks of snipers, gas, and relentless shelling, stepping into the open felt almost unthinkable. In several sectors, the Germans emerged first, hands lifted high to show they carried no weapons. Slowly, hesitantly, the British climbed out too. Down the line, a British sergeant finally called, "You come halfway, we come halfway," answering a German invitation to meet in no man's land. What followed felt nothing short of miraculous. Strangers crossed the frozen mud to shake hands, smile, and share what little comforts they had. Cigarettes, chocolate, biscuits, buttons, even letters and photographs of sweethearts and family. The men laughed, waved, and offered timid greetings in broken languages. In certain areas, the soldiers organized spontaneous soccer matches. Not the formal games of peacetime, but ragged kickabouts using anything they could find. A tin can, a bundled hat, a makeshift ball. Mud and frost became part of the fun. The war melted, if only temporarily, replaced by laughter and shared play. Elsewhere, the men helped each other bury the fallen. Graves were dug, crosses laid, and in some places, small impromptu services were held for both sides. In a world dominated by guns and death, acts of kindness and reverence took root. One British soldier, J. Reading, later wrote home, "We shook hands with them, and they gave us cigarettes and cigars. We did not fire that day. It seemed like a dream." In that frozen, mud-scarred landscape, time seemed to stand still as the war simply faded. For the first time, the men saw one another as human, fathers, sons, neighbors, from different nations, but all the same at heart. These were not career military men, but clerks, bakers, students, teachers, factory workers, and farmhands. Ordinary young men caught in an extraordinary nightmare. Yet, in that moment, through song, small gifts, shared play, and gestures of care, they reclaimed their humanity. These young men, pawns in a larger game, chose connection over conflict, if only for a fleeting, holy sliver of Christmas Day. This was the moment when image bearers recognized one another again, not as enemies, but brothers. Music and light, shared laughter, and mutual care became the truest expression of Christmas. Peace in the darkest places. A reminder that even in war, the presence of God and the capacity for human kindness can break through. When the music faded. "I don't get it. Why didn't the war just end right there?" one of my second graders asked, wide eyes sincere with bewilderment. And honestly, it's a question that still makes me pause. After Christmas, the soldiers didn't want to keep fighting. They had glimpsed a world where the enemy wasn't a faceless threat, but a fellow human being. What made the Christmas Truce so remarkable was that it wasn't planned, sanctioned, or approved by anyone in command. There were no orders, no generals waving official flags, no formal ceasefire. The soldiers themselves decided, on a quiet Christmas morning, to step out of the trenches and meet one another in peace, fully aware that every step carried personal risk. Historically, truces were almost always arranged from above, carefully timed and strategic. But this was different. It was spontaneous, fragile, and entirely born from the soldiers' own desire for humanity. Some even tried to extend it, hoping for more football games, laughter, and shared moments across the mudded barbed wire. But the generals were furious. Threats of court-martial hung over anyone caught fraternizing. In many sectors, regiments were actually rotated out, replaced by fresh soldiers who hadn't seen the truce and were ready to fight. Propaganda continued to paint the enemy as cruel and untrustworthy. Power structures refused to yield. And so, heartbreakingly, the men had to climb back in their trenches and obey their orders. But for those few miraculous hours, ordinary men had chosen connection over conflict. A fleeting Christmas miracle. In the weeks that followed, many soldiers did the bare minimum. They were hesitant to fire on men they had just celebrated Christmas with, singing carols, sharing chocolate, playing football, and even burying their dead side by side. One soldier reflected, "We don't want to kill you, and you don't want to kill us, so why shoot?" Bernard Shaw, safely observing from neutral Switzerland, commented on the absurdity of it all. "It's all hallucination, this war spirit. We all talk nonsense. German papers, French papers, English papers write the same article word for word, except the names. Tell the same lies, believe the same impossible stories." Sir H. Kingsley Wood, who had been a major in the trenches, later recalled in a 1930 House of Commons debate, "We went over in front of the trenches and shook hands with many of our German enemies. A great number of people think we did something degrading. The fact is, we did it. And I then came to the conclusion, which I have held very firmly ever since, that if we had been left to ourselves, there would never have been another shot fired. For a fortnight the truce went on. We were on the most friendly terms, and it was only the fact that we were being controlled by others that made it necessary for us to start trying to shoot one another again. The resumption of the war was a grip of a political system which was bad, and I and others who were there at the time determined never to rest until we had seen whether we could change it." But they could not. This is the part that most struck my students, and me. Humans long for peace because we were made for peace. Yet, broken systems, unchecked power, and rigid hierarchies often fail to make room for it. And still, even in the midst of war, the light of Christmas had shone, however briefly. When the truce ended, its memory lingered. Soldiers carried with them the understanding of what it meant to see one another as brothers, not enemies. In many places, they intentionally minimized violence, reluctant to harm men they had come to know as friends. For all its brevity, the Christmas Truce was a powerful reminder that hope, faith, and kindness can pierce even the darkest corners. A glimpse of something greater. Even in the mud and misery of the trenches, something remarkable happened. Ordinary people connected. Across barbed wire, a simple song became a bridge, and the carefully constructed stories of propaganda The lies that painted the enemy as cruel, monstrous, and unworthy of trust collapsed under the weight of shared laughter, shared fear, and shared humanity. In that fleeting moment, it became clear. The hearts of ordinary soldiers often longed for peace far more than the leaders in distant offices ever imagined. Even the smallest gestures, a song, a cigarette, a tossed piece of chocolate, carried enormous power. Light broke through, even if only for a few miraculous hours. And yet, this was more than human kindness. The Prince of Peace had slipped into the mud and trenches that night. Christmas, in all its quiet wonder, had reminded these young men, and reminds us still, that God's peace is possible even in the darkest, most unlikely places. The truce was, in a sense, a glimpse of the kingdom. For a few precious hours, on earth, peace, goodwill toward men was not just a phrase. It was lived reality. Even in war, even in suffering, the light of God's love reached the hearts of men, offering a reminder that peace is always possible when we choose to see other humans first. The librarian's thoughts. The story of these soldiers has flooded my mind all week. The way they risked everything for a few hours of connection. The way a simple song could pierce the fog of fear and mud. It stays with me. It makes me pause and ask myself, where in my own life do I need peace to break through? Who have I quietly labeled as the enemy when maybe they're simply misunderstood? And how can I choose connection, understanding, and brotherly love over hostility, even in the small everyday moments? The truth is, the same light that reached the trenches in 1914 can reach us today. Our modern trenches may look different. Misunderstandings, hardened hearts, old grudges, but the principle is the same. Even the smallest act of grace, a kind word, or a gentle gesture can open a space where peace can grow. Christmas reminds us that peace doesn't depend on circumstances. It only requires willing hearts. When we let it, that light can transform our lives and, perhaps, quietly the lives of those around us, just like it did on that muddy battlefield over a century ago. One last thing. In my recent flurry of Christmas Truce obsession, I stumbled upon a Sainsbury commercial from 2014 honoring the 100-year anniversary. After reading Silent Night and exploring other primary sources, I noticed moments that stretch historical accuracy, but in the spirit of Christmas, I'll keep those thoughts to myself. What matters most is the heart of the story, the hope that defies despair, peace that blooms amid chaos, and light that pierces even the darkest trenches. That truth is real, beautiful, and utterly breathtaking. The commercial may take some liberties with historical detail, but it captures the spirit of that miraculous Christmas in 1914. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend taking 5 minutes to watch, and I'll be linking that for you below. That's all for now. Take care, stay curious, and Merry Christmas, my friend.